What's going on, people? Welcome to United View and welcome back to the Tactical View. No flex this week, so you're stuck with me, and we'll be going through the Wolves game, having a little look at what went well for United, what Wolves do to challenge us that other teams perhaps don't do. And so without any further ado, let's get into the video. So, first things first, in terms of the way that Wolves tend to set up, in recent weeks under Julian Lopetegui, they've mainly favoured a 4-4-2 shape, and they've had Diego Costa and Matheus Cunha up front. And what's been interesting in recent weeks is that they've played pretty direct, which is something that not that many Premier League teams do now. Obviously, there's a lot of obsession with sort of playing through the thirds, playing out from the back. But Wolves are a lot more direct than most teams are in general, and you can see that in terms of that suits Diego Costa, it suits Cunha, and it also obviously suits the shape as well. Lemina's quite physical alongside Ruben Neves there, and they've got players who are capable of getting around the second balls, and Pedro Neto's quite good at delivering, or at least before his injury, was quite good at delivering crosses into the box. In terms of the specific threats that Wolves pose, I would say Matheus Nunes, I really like him as a player. I think he is a fantastic option. He's a really, really good ball carrier, particularly when he plays in the centre of midfield rather than out there on the wing. But he's someone that I think, if Manchester United can't get Frankie de Jong, which I've been chasing him for far too long now, it's time to move on. But I would like Matheus Nunes considered at least as an option, because I think in a team with more possession, he can really step up to the next level. And on top of his fantastic ball carrying, he can become better at passing and progressing the ball with his feet in terms of breaking lines, all that sort of stuff that we want to see from our players. In terms of the rest of the Wolves team, Nelson Semedo is a terrible, terrible defender. How that guy played for Barcelona, I will never know. But he's definitely an area that United could exploit. And also, Craig Dawson at his age probably isn't the most capable of keeping up with mobile strikers. So those are areas that could be exploited in the Wolves team. And in terms of superstar quality, there isn't an awful lot. Obviously, Diego Costa could potentially bully the likes of Victor Lindelof if he was playing like he was in seasons gone by. But Lindelof's now got a lot stronger, a lot more physical, and he's a lot more aggressive mentally. So he's much better equipped to deal with those sorts of situations. And that's pretty much it in terms of star quality. So what I wanted to have a look at is actually the way that Wolves approach the game. So I mentioned at the very start that with the way that they set up with their formation, they play a lot of direct balls, they play a lot more direct than most Premier League teams do. And I think you can see that in this. So this graph here is looking at the sort of direct play within the Premier League. And what you can see going up the graph is the long pass completion rate, so just the percentage of long passes that are completed. And going along across the graph from left to right, we've got the long passes attempted per 90. So what you can see from the start is that straight away Liverpool attempt a lot of long passes. We know that in seasons gone by they've played a lot of long passes, a lot of crosses using Trent and Robertson. Basically get the ball out to them, let them play the ball long. And for Liverpool as well, actually, at times it's been a case of rather than actually looking for long passes that necessarily hit a particular target, actually we'll just put the ball into an area and then go and press that area because their pressing was so good in previous seasons. Interestingly as well, you can see that City, in terms of their long pass completion rate, that is absolutely by far and away the best of the Premier League, probably because the likes of Erling Haaland is so good at getting on the end of those long balls. And now as well, with City, the way that they play, they can suck teams in to try and press them, but they can put the ball into space, and once the ball's in space, Haaland's getting there first most of the time. So that suits them in terms of their long pass completion rate. What you can see though with Wolves is that in terms of the number of long passes they're completing, they're actually at a pretty similar level to Brentford, and everybody knows how direct Brentford are with their play. So you can see that's actually a big threat that Wolves have, and in terms of completion as well, they're pretty good, mainly thanks to the work of Diego Costa and also the way they play with their 4-4-2 system. So that's a little bit of a background, a little bit of statistical profile on Wolves in terms of the way they try to play and the different threats that they can pose compared to some of the other teams. Now, obviously, if you're going to be facing a lot of long balls, that's going to feed into the defensive approach that your team needs to take. So what we're going to have a look at now is the way that United try to play defensively and the way that we try to get around this problem of Wolves throwing those long balls at us. So when you're facing lots of long balls, it's really important that you can go back to the basic principles of defending those long balls to make sure that you're able to win, ideally the first ball as much as possible, but also once that's been won, then win the second ball as well to make sure that the opposition can't get out of that area, and that if that ball does come out of the area, it's with a red shirt going forwards rather than with one of the Wolves players in a white shirt being able to switch the play to the opposite side, get a cross back into the box and potentially get a goal scoring chance on the end of it. So what was really important when Wolves were building out from the back or taking those goal kicks going long, we know straight away they're going to be looking for Diego Costa and Matheus Cunha, so they're going to be really tight into an area. And what that means for United is that we don't want to try and defend the entire width of the pitch. We want to be really compact to make sure that we're width-wise covering as narrow as narrow an amount of the pitch as we possibly can, but also in terms of the height that we've got on the pitch as well. We want to be fairly compact while still having enough options to move the ball forwards if we do win the first ball. So what that means is that typically we'd see the play really compressed into a smaller area of the pitch to try and deal with that long ball. And in terms of the basic principles, the essence of defending long balls, the things that we try to see is that we've got, in terms of behind Diego Costa, I'm so used to saying Diogo Costa now for the ideal David De Gea replacement that I'm still getting confused. But yes, it's Diego Costa on the pitch today, or on Saturday. You've got him and Cunha, and Lindelof and Varane were screening them from behind. Then in front, you've got Casemiro able to contest the headers in this area. You've got Christian Eriksen in there as well. You've got Antony dropping back, Bruno Fernandes dropping back, Sancho tucking in nice and narrow, and Martial sort of on the last line there, just as an option to play that ball forwards in case Casemiro is able to be really aggressive with that header and head it all the way forwards. But the basics that we needed to see was that when that ball was aimed, for example, at Diego Costa, you've got Varane able to contest the first header behind Diego Costa. You've got Lindelof, body position-wise, always on the half turn, always side on to make sure he's able to cover behind Varane in case Costa gets the flick on. But he needs to be on his toes, ready to react to whatever situation there is. You've then also got Casemiro in front of Costa whenever possible, and you've got Eriksen sort of diagonally at about a 45-degree angle, and he again is on the half turn, side on, so that whenever that ball comes in, if Casemiro wins that ball, he can head that down to Eriksen, and then Eriksen's able to play out, and he's not sort of constrained. He's on his toes, on the half turn, side on, ready to move the ball forwards or ready to move the ball wide as needed, but he's alive and ready to react. Because that's one of the most important things in terms of dealing with those second balls, is that you're ready to react to whatever happens before it's happened. If you're flat-footed, you're on your heels, not ready to react, you're sort of, maybe if Eriksen's he's facing goal, he's head on, if the ball goes behind him, he's out of the game, he's useless for that phase of play. So it's making sure those fundamentals technically are in place so that we can defend the long balls properly. And to show that, what we've got here is a picture of one of the setups or one of the situations where this sort of thing was happening. And what you can see is that you've got Casemiro here contesting the header. He's contesting the first one. You can see Lindelof just on the edge of the shot there. He's side on, ready to go backwards if he needs to cover Varane, if that ball had gone a little bit longer, potentially to Diego Costa in there. But he's also then ready, because he's on his toes, to move forward into the space if he needs to be. But you can see Eriksen as well, on his toes there, leaning forward, ready. He's side on so that he can react to whatever happens next and try to move that ball forward. So he's diagonally available there for Casemiro. You've got Sancho very narrow as well. You can see how compact this United team is to make it as difficult as possible for Wolves to get out of that zone with the long ball. So whilst at times United have been weak against long balls, in this particular game we've gone back to the basic principles, been really compact, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that obviously United have had a whole week off for the first time in pretty much since the World Cup. I wouldn't be surprised if this was something that Erik ten Hag wanted to revisit, wanted to just tidy up, making sure that in these situations we're not trying to do anything fancy. We've not got players gambling on, if we win this first ball, I'll be in next phase. The priority is you deal with that long ball, you deal with that phase of play first, and then you move out to whatever happens next. So I think what you can see there is a team that are ready to deal with that sort of situation. Even Bruno again there, side on, ready to go forward, same with Antony. And you can see from the fundamentals, from the basic principles of defending long balls, defending direct play, the team have done a really good job of that. Next, the other thing I want to say about our defensive setup then is that I think in many sort of previous games this season, United have been sort of in two minds in a lot of situations as to how to approach things. So, as you know, as we've said many times, United have this pressing structure where when the ball is high up the pitch, what we like to do is we've got the wingers to start opposite the opposition centre-backs, so Dawson and Kilman there, in terms of how wide they are, and in terms of how high they are, they'll typically start on a similar line to the fullbacks. And then what we see is once the ball goes to one side, let's say it goes to Dawson, Martial will go into Dawson, Sancho will go and press Semedo if that ball then goes wide. But that does leave us exposed potentially when if the ball then comes back across the keeper, back the other way, because then you've got the winger to press the centre-back there, leaving the opposition full-backs with time. And the reason that that can be such a problem is because in midfield behind that, we typically go man for man. So when we're facing a midfield three, what we'll normally see is our eights. So in this situation, our highest midfielders. So we'd see Bruno and Eriksen as the opposition midfielders drop in. You'd see them going man for man there. So we basically end up in a 4-1-4-1 type of shape out of possession here in the press. And what it means is that because Bruno and Eriksen are locked into those man for man battles there, if that ball goes out to the fullback and this guy isn't able to sprint to get back, United have got a 2v1 to deal with down this side because the midfielder's not able to get out quickly enough. So that's a problem that we have potentially sometimes when we're pressing, and a lot of the time I think because of our approach being so aggressive when we're high up the pitch, when we're in deeper areas we can't be quite so aggressive, because if you leave a 2v1 in this sort of area you're almost certainly conceding a cross into the box, which is potentially a dangerous chance. And so when United are deeper, what we try and do instead is we sit in a little bit more of a block. Sometimes it's a 4-1-4-1, sometimes a 4-4-2, with Bruno sort of pushing up towards to help out Martial on that top line if the ball goes back and is circulated across the opposition's back line. But what I think was really impressive from United in this game is that we're a lot more compact than we normally are. So, as we mentioned earlier, when we've got those situations where our midfielders are going high on the opposition pivot, we can end up in a situation where if the opposition pivot come deeper to try and pick up the ball, we can end up leaving a lot of space in between the lines here in this sort of gap, and it means there's a lot of work for Casemiro to cover by himself. In this game, I think partly due to the way Wolves were set up with the 4-4-2, meaning they've only got two midfielders there rather than an extra one in that space. But partly also, I think, just because we've worked on it during the week, United were much more compact in terms of having our players deeper, having those gaps between the lines much smaller when Wolves did get the ball higher up the pitch. And I think the point of the game that you could really see it was in that 10 to 15 minutes before half-time, so just after the goal, and in that period where after we've scored we want to go into half-time ahead, and when Wolves were able to get a few phases of possession together, United were getting deeper, were getting compact, but as well as the midfield dropping a little bit deeper rather than getting distracted by this man-to-man issue here, it was also quite nice to see that our defence were pushing up to try and keep that gap as small as possible as well. And obviously looking ahead to the game against potentially Manchester City, not potentially Manchester City, it will be Manchester City in the FA Cup final, it's going to be really important to keep those gaps between the lines as small as possible. Now obviously it's one thing when you're facing a 47-year-old Diego Costa who's not really going to run in behind that much, and it's a different thing when you're up against Haaland, who is going to run in behind. Obviously in that situation the defence will want to drop off, but it's good to see at the very least that the principles are being adhered to and we're doing well defensively in terms of keeping compact and knowing it's that distinction between knowing when to press, when to go man for man, when the eights need to push up high on the opposition pivot and when they should drop off, sit in a block, and particularly with the wingers as well, tucking in nice and narrow to stop any dangerous situations appearing. Now, the next thing we'll look at is in terms of Wolves' league position. So they're currently 13th in the league. I think they're on 40 points at the moment after this weekend. And what you can see here is a graph of their expected goals that they've created and the expected goals that they've conceded. And what you can see is that for the majority of the season, the expected goals against, so the chances that they're giving up, here is in the red, and you've got the expected goals or the chances they're creating here in the blue. So obviously we know that although they've got this direct play and this direct approach, in terms of what they're creating, in general, they're not creating that many chances. They're not a particularly impressive team going forward. Whereas what they're conceding at the other end is a lot of chances. And you can see this most recent data point is the United game. They conceded over 2.5 expected goals, which is a hell of a lot to be conceding in 90 minutes, whilst they only created about 0.4 XG, so not an awful lot. And you can see as well in this graph that for the majority of the season, the red line has been higher than the blue line. So given that, you'd expect in general they're not picking up too many wins. And indeed, if you look at sort of streaks or maybe points where the blue line's been ahead of the red line for longer periods of time, which is maybe points that you'd expect to, if you wanted to see a team build a bit more of a sustainable winning run, you can't really see any points where there's been a streak of 2 or 3 games where the blue's been above the red. So, I mean, I think that matches in their league form where actually they've only put streaks of 2 wins together. That's the longest consecutive number of wins that Wolves have put together is 2, and they've only done that twice all season. And you can see why in this graph they're giving up a lot of chances and not creating too many. So, knowing how many chances they give up, well, that will sort of feed into the way that United approach the game. And we knew that obviously with the Wolves 4-4-2 and the way they're trying to play, there would be obviously a lot of chances that we can create if we set up well to exploit the things that they don't do too well. So, in terms of the way Wolves set up defensively then, from the start, they set up in that 4-4-2, but the problem that they have is that the gaps between the units, the gaps between those lines are massive, and in particular, one of the biggest issues they've got is the ease at which opposition teams can disconnect the Wolves' wide midfielders in that 4-4-2 from the central ones. So, obviously, space between the lines is usually a really important thing, and the reason for that is that if an opposition player can, particularly the likes of Bruno Fernandes or Christian Eriksen, somebody with outstanding quality can get into space between the lines here, what it means is that you're distracting multiple players at once. So these players for Wolves, the pivot, if Bruno's in this space here, are worried about getting back there, but these defenders are left with a really difficult decision, because if they don't go out and press Bruno, he's got time and space, and a player like that with time and space will be able to find a good quality pass to Martial or Antony or even Jadon Sancho getting in behind. But if they do go out and close down Bruno, they'll leave a big space in behind there. So it's those gaps between units, this space between the lines here, that was really key for United in terms of how we attack the game. And Wolves aren't very good at defending it. And what made things worse from a Wolves perspective is how easy it is for opposition teams to force their wide midfielders in this sort of situation to go back and basically become a back six. So, because Semedo is not the best 1v1, you'd often see Matheus Nunes, rather than trying to help out the double pivot in the centre, he would drop back in there and help out Semedo in the wide areas, meaning that actually all it took for United was Luke Shaw to be stepping higher and wider. Nunes would get pinned back. On the other side, you've got Wan-Bissaka, where normally you'd see him underlapping. He was able to overlap when he's on the opposite side of the ball. So if the ball's on this side, you've got Wan-Bissaka really high, really wide. Pedro Neto gets pinned back. Then all of a sudden, you've got Lemina and Ruben Neves forced to defend this entire space in the middle of the pitch by themselves. And the problem is, because it's a midfield 2 rather than a midfield 3, obviously they're going to be outnumbered by the opposition midfield. So that leaves them in a really difficult dilemma there, where, let's say, as we saw a lot of the time, Wolves have this 2 strikers, so you'd have Casemiro or Eriksen sometimes stepping into a back 3 to help out there. But what it means is that these Wolves midfielders here have got a difficult dilemma. Do they track Bruno? Do they track Sancho, who's dropping into space between the lines? Or do they go out and try and put pressure on Eriksen, try and put pressure on Casemiro? And if they go out and try and press them, they'll get played around very, very easily. So what it was from United was that because we were able to disconnect the Wolves' wide midfielders rather than letting them come inside here to try and help out with this overload that United had, we were pinning them back in the back line using our fullbacks. That meant it was really easy for United to dominate the ball in the central areas and create chances through there by getting our quality players time and space on the ball. So you can see that now in this next image that we've got here. And you can see that in this situation here, as it stands, you've got Luke Shaw out there on the far side. Let me just drag that out of the way. You've got Luke Shaw out here on the far side, and you can see that's Nelson Semedo there. He's worried about Jadon Sancho. You've got Matheus Nunes in here. So he's not helping out with the midfield in that situation. You've got Ruben Neves there. You've got Mario Lemina there. But Matheus Nunes isn't helping out with the midfield. He's fully pinned back in that back line as part of a back 6. And on this side, you've got Pedro Neto there, pinned by, you've got Antony here, and you've got Wan-Bissaka just out of shot a little bit further wide. And what that means is that midfield have got a really difficult situation. Now, at this specific moment, they're doing a decent job of it because they've stayed fairly compact, in touch with their defensive line there. That gap vertically isn't too big. But the problem is, as soon as that ball goes out to Eriksen, there's a difficult situation there for the Wolves midfielders as to whether to go and press, and if they don't, Eriksen's very easily able to find Luke Shaw or find a ball, and you can see that really well in this next image here. So you can see in that previous one how we use the fullbacks to create that space in midfield, and in this one now you can see a dilemma that gives the Wolves players. So you've got again Luke Shaw in this position, you've got Matheus Nunes there, there's Semedo there worried about Jadon Sancho who's tucked in there, in that position there. And what you've got is, because Nunes has dropped back into the back line, you've got Ruben Neves and Mario Lemina there going to press. Bruno Fernandes has dropped a little bit deeper in this situation. You've got Christian Eriksen there, and all it would take is Bruno to play one pass out wide to Luke Shaw, who can then access Jadon Sancho in the lines because the Wolves players have sprinted forwards. So what you can see here, and again on the opposite side, you've got Antony who's tucked in there, a little bit narrower here to access that space between the lines to make the most of it, whereas you've got Wan-Bissaka a little bit wider to pin back Pedro Neto. And because the Wolves' wide midfielders weren't able to help out in the central areas, it meant that United had this really easy overload. Look at the amount of time Bruno's got there. He's got all the time in the world really to find Eriksen, find Luke Shaw and find that ball between the lines. All it would take really is Bruno to play that ball to Eriksen, Jadon Sancho to make a little dart that way whilst Lemina's got sucked into Eriksen, and Jadon Sancho suddenly in that space between the lines. So whereas United typically, under Erik ten Hag, have seen a situation where we've got our wingers providing the width, so we've got the minimum width principle, meaning sort of that the wingers are just wider than the fullbacks, where the our fullbacks tend to underlap and look for these inside areas. In this game, because we wanted to disconnect the Wolves wide midfielders, what you'd actually see is that the fullback on the opposite side of the ball, so if the ball's here with Casemiro, it'll be Luke Shaw, he would go really high and wide, pin back Matheus Nunes in that back six, and what that means then is that you've got Jadon Sancho in this gap between the lines, so you've got always somebody free in this midfield area, whether it's Eriksen, Bruno or Sancho in that gap there, depending on who that pivot choose to go and press, you've always got somebody free. So it creates that massive problem for Wolves and means United are very easily able to create chances. Now, obviously, in the second half, Julian Lopetegui did change things. He switched from the 4-4-2. To be honest, he actually changed it towards the end of the first half, where he had Diego Costa sitting up front by himself and Cunha dropping a little bit deeper to try and help out in midfield. Didn't really work because United still had too much time and space. Cunha didn't really understand the instructions, didn't really understand what he was doing. And in the second half, Lopetegui brought off, who did he bring off? He brought off Pedro Neto, and he brought on Hwang Hee-chan, and he went to a 4-3-3. So he put Hwang on the right, he put Cunha on the left, Diego Costa there. Matheus Nunes went into midfield with Ruben Neves sitting deeper, Nunes and Lemina pressing a bit higher as eights. And the idea there was that you put a bit more pressure on United in the build-up phase, using sort of your eights high on Casemiro and Eriksen. But the reality is that now, with only the one striker, it was really easy for United's centre-backs to then start stepping out from the back, creating the extra man and be able to find those balls forward. So the tactical change was adapted to very quickly, very easily by Erik ten Hag, so there wasn't really any problem. And as we saw, it was those gaps between the units, between the lines, that were the problem for Wolves and where United were able to get so much joy. And what you can see then is, straight away, you can see it was a pretty easy game for United in terms of the amount of XG we created in comparison to Wolves. But what was quite interesting is that first sort of half an hour, just before the goal, United didn't really create too much in the way of clear-cut chances in terms of actual shots. There was that brilliant pullback that Wan-Bissaka had that no one was on the end of, which is a fantastic opportunity, I guess, but no one quite there to put the shot away, and obviously XG only looks at shots. But from that moment onwards, it really was incredibly comfortable for United, and you can see, interestingly, that United stepped it up really in that 15 minutes towards the end of the first half, and then pretty similar in the end, towards the end of the second half here, where from about 78 minutes, United really pressed hard, created lots of chances, and were fantastic for the rest of the game, creating that massive jump in XG, which you can see, and that eventually led to the second goal that we scored. So, again, a fairly routine win for United, a really nice, easy one, and what you can see is that Erik ten Hag has used the training time we've had, that week on the training ground, 2 days off, 2 days of rest for the players, a little bit of work on our defensive shape, particularly defending the long ball, but also that distinction between when to press high and when we want to sit deeper in our block, and making sure that when we do sit in our block, we're nice and compact, the gaps between the units are nice and tight, and also the wingers do come in and are really narrow in that 4-4-2 or 4-1-4-1 that we sometimes go into when we're in our block. And finally as well, I think it was nice to see that United were able to create a fairly free-flowing attacking display, and there were some nice relationships, nice link-up play between Antony and Wan-Bissaka. I thought Antony was brilliant. Yes, he didn't quite make the right decision every time, but it's so much nicer to have a player who's a little bit raw in terms of decision-making in the final third, but still gives it everything, always goes forward, always wants to be on the end of something, rather than a player potentially on the opposite flank, no names mentioned, that doesn't really look like he's that keen to be involved in the game, doesn't have that hunger, that desire to get after the ball, try and press, win it back, doesn't have that desire to sort of take on his man every time. And look, as much as Antony's getting criticised at the moment, he is going to be a fantastic player for United. I know the jury's still out on him for the moment in terms of whether he's good enough, whether he's got sort of that rapid pace in his locker. He showed yesterday that when he's got open space to go into, he is quick. It's just at the moment, I think, the way he touches the ball, the way he needs the ball to be connected to his foot, he's not quite as quick when he's got the ball as he is without it. So that's something he can definitely work on in due course, as is his decision making. But the positive for United is that we've just had a week off. We've got another week to prepare for the Bournemouth game. Top four should be wrapped up with a big win away at Bournemouth. And following that, We've got the run-up to the FA Cup final. We've got Chelsea on the Thursday after in the league, and the final day against Fulham. Will be nice to see some of the youngsters play in that game. Hopefully Kobbie Mainoo gets a game. And then finally, finishing the season with a big game against Manchester City. In the run-up to that, we'll have the usual content for you, Tactical View each Monday, and we'll have a special edition of the Tactical View looking ahead to what we can expect from that Manchester City game and thinking of a possible game plan to beat them. The fantastic team that they are, what can we come up with? We'll be having a look at that in the few days leading up to the game. Cheers for watching. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below, and we'll see you again very soon on United View.